Welcome to another Sharing Your Passion. My guest today has been described as a humble and joyous man who lives his truth. Part of that truth has been a long-standing communication with what he calls the living Jesus. He has written extensively about his experiences with Jesus in a book, a wonderful book called Seek Ye First the Kingdom. And he has also been a regular blogger and contributor through his website to a wonderful series of articles under the name of Diary of a Christ Communicant. Now, he has also been described as an extraordinary, ordinary man. And before we came on camera, when I asked him how he wanted to be introduced, he said, "I have no title, I have no wish to be introduced as anything at all. I'm just me." Isn't that wonderful? So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Brian Longhurst. Brian, thanks very much for joining me on Sharing Your Passion.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Glenn. I'm overjoyed and delighted.
Thank you.
A little astonished, I have
to say. Well, that's a nice prompt, actually, Brian, because I must admit, we'll sort of kick off with just a little background to how I first met Brian. And I first met Brian at a workshop given by Michael Rhodes. Many of you will remember me interviewing him about a year ago for this very series. And at one point, Michael took me aside and he said, "You know, if there's anyone else you'd like to interview, then, you know, I would recommend you speak to Brian." Now, I didn't know Brian at that point, didn't know him from Adam, hadn't actually spoken to him, but I managed to sort of catch him in the break. And we started talking and he began telling me about his relationship with Jesus. Now, I'm sure Brian will forgive me, but my immediate reaction was, "Oh my God, you know, is this a Jesus freak or you know, someone like that?" But of course, as is often the way in these things, Brian turned out to be a wonderful friend and someone that, you know, once I really got to know him, it gave off an incredible aura of wisdom and great insights into not just Jesus, but also more broadly in terms of wisdom of the world, you might say. And within a few weeks, I was reading his book avidly, and I guess time passed and other people came into the frame, but a few weeks ago I just had this voice in my head saying Brian Longhurst, and I knew...
I'm not the only one then.
There might be another one somewhere, maybe I've got the wrong one, but I don't think I have. And so it occurred to me that it was time for Brian to share his passion, and what a passion too, Brian. How did it all start?
Well, synchronicity is a term that has played such a huge role in this whole journey, which started really when I was in my late teens and I emigrated to Canada. And on board the ship I had an out-of-body experience, which was the first time that had ever happened to me, which was a bit of a portent of the amazing adventure, spiritual adventure that lay before me during my time in Canada. And there, by synchronicity, I was brought into contact with an elderly Yorkshire woman called Olga Park. And she had had a lifetime of experience of what I call the living Jesus. I was brought into contact with a book she had written. I read that, and even as I was reading it, I knew I had to contact her. To my delight, I discovered that she also was living in Vancouver. I phoned her up, introduced myself, told her I had to come and see her as soon as possible, and that started a friendship, and she became my spiritual mentor. She started talking about Jesus in a way that I had never heard anybody speak about him before, least of all in the church. for her, Jesus was a real, present-day, living, real experience in her life. He had manifested to her. She had extensive, thousands, tens of thousands of words, of records of his speaking to her. This awakened in me a desire to know this real Jesus. I'd heard about the Jesus that the church talks about, a Jesus of judgment and to be feared and a bit trepidatious about. The Jesus that she described is just love. Love, gentleness, understanding, patience, everything that one might expect and hope for in one's absolutely best ever friend. And that awakened in me an absolute passion to come to know and experience this Jesus. Not just hear about him, hear about other people telling me about this amazing character from history. And so it came to the point where I would kneel at my bedside every night, asking him to give me an experience of his living reality. This went on for probably 2 or 3 months. And one night, as I finished my outpouring, asking for this experience, I stood up and he was there. Suddenly he was there in the corner of the room, manifested in his glory. His countenance was brighter than the sun, but didn't hurt my eyes at all. And his light filled the room. As I took this in, he started to move towards me. He wasn't walking, he was gliding. He was 2 or 3 inches off the floor and he was gliding towards me. As he moved, he started speaking to me. He eventually got to within about a foot of where I was standing, right in my face. And then he'd finished speaking by the time he stopped, and he enveloped me with his love. This was a love I had never experienced before. The world knows nothing of this kind of love. This love is unconditional, it's perfect, it's universal, it's all encompassing. It completely envelops us and takes us over. And I knew that he loved me with a personal love and yet also a universal love, such as I'd never experienced or heard about before. I was totally overwhelmed by this, and I had such a powerful and overpowering feeling of his love for me that it filled me, my entire aura, every aspect of my being, with what I can only describe as an orgasm of the soul, but immeasurably more than any such bodily experience. And it was, that is there for us. That is the experience awaiting us all, eternally, if we begin a journey of waking up to the reality of who we really are. We're all really the same as Jesus. We've just forgotten. He's remembered who he really is, the Son of God. We've forgotten it. Most of the rest of us have forgotten. So he told me some years later that he had come to lead me back to God. And I've been on this wondrous journey with him since 1967. And it just gets better and better, more and more expansive, as I begin to awaken to the remembrance of who not only I really am, but who all of us really are. It's time for us to claim our true being, the truth of our being. It's time now. This is the moment in the unfolding great awakening process that we're now in the midst of. The world is beginning to see that something's happening, and this is what it is.
Now you've had 46 years, is that right? 46 years of this relationship with Jesus, if I can call it that.
Yes.
How has it developed during those 46 years? Has the message always been the same? Has your communication, tended to, has it been context dependent? How has it developed?
Yes. He understands us. He knows everything about us. He knows us far better than we know ourselves, immeasurably better. He knows us totally. We're only hovering around the periphery of even knowing who our persona self is or why we're here. So for the first number of years, he took me on a journey from where I was gradually to the place where I could start to understand things from a more cosmic or universal perspective. And for example, about a little over a year after this first manifestation, and there were a number of other occasions and experiences of him, but never at that level, one night I was kneeling at a little prayer table that I had set up in the apartment I was living in out in Vancouver, and I was saying the Lord's Prayer, and suddenly I became aware that Jesus is floating down through the ceiling from where the wall and the ceiling met above my head.
So this is a visual representation of him.
I actually was aware of him. We don't see him with our bodily sight, we see him with our soul awareness, but we know every detail. It's an all-encompassing...
So is this a telepathic thing, or is it a visual and telepathic thing?
I think it's a soul-to-soul sharing.
Okay.
It's difficult to find words in the terminology available to us, which is basically devised to describe a three-dimensional so-called reality,
yes.
To meaningfully describe something that is of an entirely greater dimension beyond all that.
Right.
But he was in a sitting position as he floated down, and he sat on this chest of drawers just to the side of me, only about a hand's breadth away from where I was kneeling. And he sat there. I was pretty astonished at what was going on, and I didn't know quite how to handle this, because I'm in the middle of saying the Lord's Prayer, speaking to God the Father, and here's God the Son coming down uninvited into my presence. Always welcome, but I hadn't invited him to come, but here he was.
Yes.
And so he saw my predicament, and he said, "It's okay, I've got plenty of time, there's no rush, carry on, I'll wait." And he sat there with his legs dangling over the edge of this chest of drawers, swinging his lower legs like this, and with his hands clasped in his lap, twiddling his thumbs. Well, this is astonishing to me, because this is Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, the head honcho. And I didn't expect him to start behaving like any ordinary man.
Right.
But here he was. The whole objective of this and other experiences like it was to win my trust and my confidence, my absolute trust, that here was a man that I didn't need to be afraid of, that I could be at peace with, that I could be at ease in his presence, in his company, that I could talk to him as I'm talking to you, or talking to any friend or acquaintance or anyone. And so this process led me on this journey of building my trust, building my confidence, building the relationship. This was, most of us are growing up in today's Western society and culture thinking we're down here, lowly and unworthy. Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, is up high, unreachable. And the gap is so great between us, it can never be breached. His purpose in all this that I'm describing was to demonstrate to me and give me the experience that that is not actually true.
That you're equals.
That the real Jesus is a regular guy. He'd rather be in the pub than in the church, because that's where he can communicate with people without all the pomp and the pretense and the nonsense. So, and in fact, there have been many occasions when my friend Steve and I have been in the pub for what we call spiritual fellowship, and Jesus has been right there with us. And I've recounted some of these in my book. He's an ordinary man who has remembered who he really is, eternally radiant, loving, perfect, innocent, and he's come to remind us that that is the actual truth of who all the rest of us are. And I'm happy to say that he is not just appearing to me, but to thousands and probably millions of people. I've now, in the last few years, met quite a few people who are in a similar relationship with Jesus. I knew nothing of this for decades. For probably 40 years, I thought I only had awareness that I was the only one. So it's been a great relief to me.
You can imagine.
If I'm a fruitcake, there are lots of fruitcakes.
Perfect. Has there been, I know there's a sense from your book of there being you as a harbinger, I think you call it, as a messenger, but Jesus giving you or connecting with you in such a way that enables you, if you like, to pass on that message. Is that how you see it? And what is the message?
Well, most of us in a Western Orthodox Christian culture have a lot of misapprehensions about who Jesus is and what he is. Most of us have grown up with the idea that Jesus is coming to judge the quick and the dead, and that if we are found wanting, falling short of the mark, we'll be for the high jump. None of that is true. And the scriptures actually support that none of this is true, because he is quoted in the gospel records as saying, "I have not come to judge the world, I have come to save the world." He doesn't mean the planet from any pollution, he's talking about the world of humanity, separated from our oneness in God, who is our creator, the creator spirit. And that's the saving that he's doing. And he's come to be a messenger from the Almighty, from the Creator, that this is the reality of our being, and now is the time for an awakening to that reality. This is the time. There is a great awakening taking place on planet Earth. Most people are a bit bewildered by it, but there is a very definitive purpose behind all this, which is gradually being unfolded, and more people are beginning to get the bigger picture of what this is about. So he's been sharing with me, and I've got hundreds of thousands of words of recorded communings with him. He's been sharing with me a straightening out of our perceptions about what is reality. We've got, on the one hand, we perceive everything around us as being reality. It's what I call time and place. But there is another reality which is the opposite, and that is eternity, or heaven, or the eternal reality, or truth. And those terms describe something which is in a totally different place of mind and understanding from all that we have been taught by our parents, by our teachers in school, by our experiences in this world of three dimensions. It is almost totally different from everything we have been believing for generation after generation, for thousands of years, longer, an indeterminate time. And that transformation, that awakening, is taking place right now.
Yeah. And this is the same awakening, is it, or a similar awakening to what some of the spiritual teachers are talking about? Some call it the consciousness shift.
Yeah.
Some call it awakening. Some, there are different names.
Yes.
to refer, I think, to broadly what you're saying, which is, as I understand it, getting in touch with, some people say, the God self or the divine self, or breaking through the ego mind, you might say,
yes,
to get to that higher mind,
yes,
the higher self, as some people call it,
yeah,
and that is our true place. That is who we really
yes,
are. We're not who we think we are in this 3D
yes,
world. We're actually
immeasurably more.
Yeah. So that's your understanding, is it?
In the Bible, Jesus says the kingdom of God is within. So don't bother going out looking for the kingdom or the Messiah or the Christ out there. You won't find him out there. The truth is within.
Yeah.
And I think there are millions of people today who are aware of that, and they use this terminology, talking about going within. And so this is where we become rejoined as one in the sonship of God, restored to our oneness in God, within. It's nothing to do with the physical world out there. This is of the mind and the spirit. The truth is in our mind. We've just pulled down a blind, a shutter, a veil of unbelief, which has caused us to go into a state of forgetfulness of the truth of who we really are.
Now, your book is called Seek Ye First the Kingdom, and as I understand it, the full quote on that is, Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven or of God, and all else shall be added to you, or something along those lines. I may not have it completely accurately.
That's about right.
And that, as I understand it, is saying broadly what I think you're saying, is that it's to have what we truly desire, it has to be within us first.
Yes.
It's the old adage of, as within, so without. Is that right?
Well, it's already within us, but everything we see and have discernment of with our bodily senses is a distraction from going within. And so this is one reason why people who pray or meditate close their eyes. They want to shut off the outward distractions that we've made up. All the world we see around us is something we've made up. It's like a dream. It's a very real seeming dream, but it's nevertheless unreality. There are two possibilities. Either time and place are real, or eternity is real. Both cannot be. It's either one or the other. If we decide that maybe eternity is the only reality, that precludes time and place from being reality. So we can go into that place within by closing our eyes and attuning or becoming at one with the God self within.
Yeah.
And that's where the connection is. It's in our heart, really. The heart is the seat of the soul. And the heart is also our real mind. It is the Christ mind. The head mind, as I sometimes call it, is intellect, which is a device of ego to cause us to debate, to discuss, to doubt, to philosophize. You don't need to philosophize about truth. When you know truth, you don't need to discuss it. People can spend multiple incarnations pondering what is the truth, but they'll only actually find the truth which is already within them by going within. And that's what Jesus has been teaching me over the decades.
Now, in the book, you also refer to quite a few other, quite a lot, as I said, quotes from the Bible.
Yes.
Which I think, if I've understood you correctly, have been misunderstood or misinterpreted.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of these? Because I think it's quite instructive to actually, see another perspective, if you like, from the so-called vengeful God to an all-loving God, and this difference between oneness and separation as well that you refer to.
Well, there are an increasing number of people, well, there are a number of people, I don't know whether they're increasing, but there are a number of people who discern that the Bible actually is describing two Jesuses. One is the Jesus of wrath and anger and vengeance and judgment, who's going to come and judge us all, and if we don't come up to the mark, we'll be for the high jump.
That's definitely Jesus, is it? That's not the God of the Old Testament. That
is Jesus as well, talking about these aspects.
Right.
And it is presented in a number of ways in the gospel records as being who and what Jesus is. But that isn't the real Jesus at all. The real Jesus is a Jesus who loves us unconditionally. Now, I don't think the word unconditional is accepted at face value. People say Jesus and God are unconditional love, but. Well, there are no buts with God or Jesus. They love us unconditionally. They accept us for what we are, seemingly warts and all, and they can do that because the warts and all, the dream about judgment and genocide and war and killing and hatred and greed and all the stuff that we encounter if we switch on the 6 o'clock news, that's all made up. We've made that up. It's nothing to do with God. This was a mad moment of wondering what it might be like to get into a place away from God. It's well described in Jesus' parable of the Prodigal Son, where the son comes to the father and says, I want to go away and do my own thing in a far country. So the father says, okay, off you go. Go for it. But the son runs into trouble. He spends all his inheritance on riotous living, as the Bible says. And then he encounters a famine where he's in this far country. And spiritually, we are in a place of deep famine on planet Earth now. And probably, it could be argued, have always been.
Is this because people don't understand spirituality, do you think? I mean, what is spirituality for you?
Well, that's, for me, a terribly important question. And I can answer it best by saying spirituality and religion are actually diametrically opposed.
So the two are not synonymous?
No.
Right.
And I think a lot of people think they are. Religion is about control through fear. Spirituality is about freedom through love. And those two statements are diametrically opposed. And the church has had control over the masses for many, many centuries, and that was through fear. Control through fear. The real Jesus is about freedom through love, and that's coming out now, and people are beginning to recognize this fundamental difference between religion and spirituality.
Do you think people are waking up to this idea of being controlled? I mean, not just by the church, but by government and you know, dare I say, the financial industry and pretty much every other industry.
Yes.
I mean, you know, just hypothetically, of course.
Of course. Allegedly.
Allegedly, exactly. Back to my lawyer days. But what's your take on that, Brian?
Oh, absolutely, I agree. Now is the time of what some people call the Great Awakening, and that is all-encompassing. You can't separate this spiritual awakening from any other aspect of our experience in daily life, with a body, with a mortgage and bills and worries about whether the job is secure and so on. Jesus is a pragmatist. He knows all this, he understands all this, and there is what he has described to me over the decades as a great rescue program in which all this is going to be outworked. And I've been told many times from, again I use the term, the realms of light, which isn't just Jesus, but untold numbers of souls who have espoused their lives to him and his great rescue program. And I have been told many times that the Great Rescue Program is infallible and unstoppable. Now those are pretty convincing terms, that you can't equivocate over that. This is, we either say, okay, this is it, I'm going for it, or not. And a lot of people will doubt. I've had doubts, but I'm now at the place where I am totally without one shred of doubt that the Great Rescue Programme is infallible and unstoppable, and it's out working right now.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about that? Because I think in your book, I mean, there are two or three, probably more, but two or three stories and things you write about in the book, which I found really fascinating and enlightening, and thinking, wow, this is something I must ask Brian about. One of them is, I think, connected with the Great Rescue Programme in this sense, and that is when you talk about coming across Hugh Dowding's book, Lichgate,
yes.
and how you then became part of this, how would I describe it, part of this team of souls, if you like, living souls, who were able to rescue so-called lost souls or earthbound souls, yes. who had become, how would you describe it, stuck in a state where they didn't know whether they were living or dead. Yeah. To the 3D, to our 3D world, they were dead, but they hadn't actually crossed over into the light, I think, as some people would say. Yeah. Now, you were partly instrumental, I think, catalysed maybe by Dowding, but please say.
Yes, I was.
Into actually, facilitating that yourself. I mean, that's amazing. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've been aware of the reality of the spirit world and souls in that state of being from childhood. So I was completely accepting of this. It made absolute sense. And so when I read Hugh Dowding's book, he was Air Vice Marshal of the Royal Air Force during the war, head of fighter command.
Yeah.
And he was approached by souls from the realms of light who told him...
Whilst he was still living?
While he was... during the war.
Right.
This was during the war when he was head of fighter command in the Royal Air Force. And he was visited by enlightened beings from the spirit world, who said, look, there are a lot more people dying in quotes, being projected from their embodied state because of the war, many in horrifying circumstances, and they're stuck and they need help.
It's like a case of suspended animation.
Yes. What I call a time warp, where they're stuck in the conditions that they were experiencing at the moment of being projected from their earthly body. So they said, we need help in rescuing, these people need rescuing from this being stuck in this horrifying condition. Now, the lower can't have awareness of the higher, so people who are in darkness don't have any awareness of the light of heaven, if you will, the higher realms of spiritual reality or awareness.
So like higher dimensions.
Yes. So, and they explained to Hugh, but with willing souls who are embodied and ready to cooperate with us from the realms of light, we can take you to people who are out of the body during your sleep time.
Right.
We can take you to people in this condition, and you as an embodied person can have awareness of us, and you can have awareness of them.
Right.
Both. So you act as a bridge or a link, a mechanism whereby the higher can make contact
with the lower
via this medium channel with the lower, people who are stuck. Well, he was also completely convinced of the reality of the spirit world and that we survive this phenomenon that we refer to as death. And so he was very willing to cooperate, and there were a number of many stories in his book Lichgate about this.
Tell us about your own experience. You say that you were asleep and you had an experience during sleep of going to these sort of suspended or stuck souls and connecting them with a higher being. Is that how it worked?
Most of my experience of the rescue work have been during my waking consciousness.
Ah, okay.
While I have been conscious of the world around me and standing upright, moving about, whatever. A number of them were during our mystical communion with Christ service, which is described in my book and on my website, in which we'd be aware of the room around us and the goings on during the communion service, and then I'd suddenly be aware of another reality around us. One of them, the example that comes first to mind was, during the service, suddenly Teresa's brother John, who passed away in 1979, age 35.
Teresa's your wife, yeah?
Teresa's my wife.
Yeah.
Suddenly I heard John singing
Mine eyes have seen the
glory of the coming of the Lord.
Yeah.
The Battle Hymn of the Republic, I believe our American cousins describe it as. And I thought, what's going on? That's not part of the service. And as I became aware of him singing this wonderful hymn, very stirring tune, I became aware I was transported to the Old West in the pioneering days. And here before me was the scene of about half a dozen US cavalrymen from the 1800s out in pioneering western part of America. And they were gathered round the flagpole at their little fort outpost in the flag lowering ceremony. And they were singing this same hymn, "My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." These men their uniforms were tattered, they were dusty. You could tell that they were in a place of deep fear and uncertainty,
right,
not knowing what was going on.
Right.
But they were trying to hang together.
Yes.
With the senior ranking officer was a sergeant, and as I beheld this scene, one of them suddenly became aware of me, and he went like this, raised his hands above his face as if to say, "Oh, this is a sight I'm not ready for."
Yeah.
And he stuttered to his friends, "Look, an angel!" Well, I was able to explain to him that I'm not an angel, quite far from it, but that I am a friend, a visitor from another time, still embodied,
yes,
and I've been brought to them to help them, to become aware of the fact that they have not survived in bodily form, that they are what they would know as dead,
yes,
but they haven't yet realised it.
Right.
Probably as a result of a skirmish with the indigenous population of Native Americans.
Right.
Possibly even from one of Custer's battles. Who knows? It doesn't matter. And so as I was explaining this to them, I found myself saying, I have a friend with me who, like you, was also a soldier, and he's in spirit. Unlike me, he's in spirit. And he's here to help you. And if you can accept the words that I'm saying to you as being true, you will become aware of him. He'll be able to then come and help you and take you to the place where you really belong, a place of peace and freedom from doubt and fear and uncertainty and what's going to happen next. And at that point, John stepped forward and they became aware of him. I could see that suddenly they were aware of him there. And he stepped forward with his hands upraised in friendship, greeting, amity. And so he started explaining to them what was really going on. And so he said, if you want to come with me, I'll take you somewhere much more pleasant than this. And so they were listening very intently to what he was saying. And obviously, because they could see him, he was obviously very real to them, and he obviously knew what he was talking about. He was speaking with authority, and they were ready to accept that authoritative way of describing the situation.
Right.
And so they went with him. He came walking back toward me to go past where I was, on into a place of the light, and they were following him with a new sense of hope and a new spring in their heel. So, and as John got up next to me, he raised his hands in a high five and gave me a huge theatrical wink, as if to say, job done.
We've done it.
A nice cooperative rescue
Yeah.
exercise. And John couldn't have done that without me, because I, being embodied, was able to have awareness at the psychic level of them in their predicament, but also of him and the others from the realms of light. So it's this bridging mechanism. That's just one example. We've had untold numbers of other similar, well, dissimilar, but similar in the sense of helping people to be
To
rescued,
cross over, as it were.
to come back to a more
To
realistic awareness.
In fact, I think there's an example you mentioned in your book, isn't there, where Hugh Dowding himself went to some airmen or something in the desert, and they'd crashed their aircraft or something. Is that right?
Yes.
And he actually went to them.
Yes.
And of course they were astonished to see the head of RAF Fighter Command. I think they were bomber squadron,
they were
or something, but they recognised him, and he was able to help them in a similar way. Is that right?
Yes. This RAF bomber had crashed or been shot down in North Africa, and these probably about 7 crew members, none of them had survived the impact, but they thought they had. They'd been projected from their body by the impact, but they thought they had survived, and they believed that they were still there, waiting by the plane for somebody to come and rescue them. Well, Hugh Dowding, asleep in his bed at night in London, was taken out of the body by those from the realms of light who'd brought him into this rescue operation.
Right.
They took him to North Africa. The airmen immediately saw who it was. They knew perfectly well who it was. And they thought, well, first of all, what is a senior officer from Fighter Command coming from London to North Africa to talk to people from Bomber Command? But because he was a very high-ranking officer, he had their attention.
Right, of course.
So he was able to explain to them what had actually happened, and that they were what they would believe was, or understood as being dead. And so they were able to be brought to a place of awareness of their loved ones in spirit, and could go off with them into a place of peace. There are hospitals in the spirit world where people who've had a traumatic demise can undergo a period of rescue, of restoration, recuperation, rehabilitation, to this new place that they find themselves in.
And Hugh Dowding wrote about this in his book, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you don't believe Brian, get a copy of Hugh Dowding's book. Is it still available, Brian?
It is, yes.
It's called Lichgate. So, yeah, fantastic.
It's in the library system, and I believe it's been recently republished, so it's available on Amazon and various other.
Wonderful. Now, it struck me when I read this that this is a wonderful metaphor, isn't it? This is a wonderful metaphor for what's happening now, i.e. that we are awakening to our spiritual reality.
Yes.
You might say, from the waking dead. Am I right?
Yes.
And how would you put it, Brian? I don't want to steal your thunder, but isn't that right? I mean, it's what is the famous quote from, I think, I've forgotten the chap's name.
Pierre Teilhard
de Chardin. Yes, that we are spiritual beings in human form, or something of that. So is that part of the metaphor, do you think?
Well, yes, we've been. There is that saying. I don't know whether it's from Desjardins, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience,
Right.
and that is true. But it's destined to cease being true. What is now in the early stages of unfolding is us as spiritual beings
Having a spiritual
awaking
experience.
to a spiritual experience.
Right, okay.
We don't need a human or bodily experience
Yes,
anymore,
I see.
because that's not who we are.
Right.
We are spiritual beings, eternal, effulgent spiritual beings.
But that does beg the question, doesn't it? What are we doing here anyway? What are we doing here then? If we're spiritual beings and we're meant to be having a spiritual experience, what are we doing?
We made a mistake.
We made a mistake, okay.
Yes.
So please elaborate.
We made a mistake. The parable of the prodigal son describes it quite succinctly by saying that this rich man's son decided that he wanted to leave his father's house and estate and go off on his own and do his own thing. And so, having free will, which humanity is endowed with, the father said, okay, you're free to go and do your own thing and have your own experience.
Right.
So he takes his inheritance and he goes into a far country, which is time and place, from his home in eternity. And there he encounters, the record states that he wastes his inheritance on riotous living, which is what we've been doing on planet Earth, raping and pillaging and plundering and polluting and not having any mind for the consequences. Until a great famine arises, and then he finds himself in dire straits, and he's starving, and the word says, and when he had come to himself. That's a terribly important bit of phraseology.
Right.
It means when he had come to the place of realizing that this wasn't where he really belonged, that he belonged back in his father's house, eternity, a metaphor for waking up, when he had come to himself, he said, I will return to my father's house. And even though I'm no longer worthy to be called his son, his servants are getting better fed and better treated than I am here in this far country. So I'll go back, throw myself on his mercy, and say, I have sinned before God and against heaven, and am no longer worthy to be called your son, but take me on as a servant. But his father sees him coming from afar off, and he runs to greet him, and embraces him, and kisses him, and brings him back into his home. And there's a banquet feast and a great celebration at the return of the son that was lost, but now is found. And that is a very simple parable way of describing what we are in the process of going through. We left our father's house, went off on our own into this far country, which wasn't what we thought it was going to be. It's turned into a nightmare, because it's the opposite. The only way to get away from our father's house is to get into a state of mind which is the opposite of what our father's house really is, which is love and peace and joy and comfort, all the things where there is no fear, no guilt, only eternal joy and ecstasy. And there isn't too much of that going on in planet Earth or in the physical universe. It's a place that's constantly changing, whereas eternity is changeless. And so that parable really describes it quite well. I resonate powerfully with that.
Fantastic.